I'd just like to say, to start with, that both Guy and Stephen's talks were really fascinating. I found them very moving. And I think that's exactly the kind of journalism which we should be looking for in the coverage of this conflict, and it shows what can be done and what should be done by the media. But I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about the politics of the conflict from both the British perspective but also the regional perspective. Because it's now almost 8 years since the US and Britain launched the War on Terror with the attack on Afghanistan, the so-called Operation Enduring Freedom. And we were told at that time, if you remember, that the conflict would be all over by Christmas, or in fact it was all over by Christmas. Women were throwing off their burqas, kites were flying, journalists who'd cast doubt on the whole operation and the invasion were ridiculed and taken to task by the government. Downing Street published a special hall of shame, a name and shame of the bad journalists who had dared to suggest that the invasion of Afghanistan was going to lead to a long-term and bloody foreign occupation. I'm sorry to say I was one of those named and shamed, and 8 years later, 8 years later, of course, we're still there, and it is indeed a long and bloody occupation. Now, if you remember, it was launched in response to the 9/11 attacks. Contrary to what is often said, there was no direct UN authorization of the invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, if you look at the resolutions, they don't even mention the word Afghanistan. They only talk about self-defense, which of course is part of the UN Charter anyway. And of course the training for the 9/11 attacks was of course mostly done in Germany and the US, according to the Americans' own account. But this attack plunged, as some of the others have already mentioned, into what was a pre-existing Afghan civil war, itself the product of an earlier Western intervention. Now, what were the original aims of the invasion? Stated at the time by President Bush. 1. The capture, alive or dead, of Osama bin Laden. 2. The capture, alive or dead, of Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban. 3. The destruction of Al-Qaeda. Now, 8 years later, not a single one of those aims has been achieved. Mullah Omar is still at large, Osama bin Laden is still at large, and Al-Qaeda is very far from having been destroyed at all. Nor have the other aims that have been come up with in an ever-changing kaleidoscope of war aims, whether it's the promotion of democracy, the eradication of opium, preventing terror attacks. Instead, the US and NATO have brought back the warlords who dominated Afghanistan before the Taliban came to power. They've been installed in phony elections and driven the Taliban and Al-Qaeda over the border into Pakistan. So what's the result? The result is escalating guerrilla war, thousands of Afghan civilians killed, as we've seen so tragically, rampant corruption, an increase in violence against women. And Afghanistan, of course, now is the heroin capital of the world under NATO occupation. And of course, as we've seen in the last week, we've got now the highest level of attacks on NATO forces, the 15 British soldiers killed in 9 days, which has led to this sort of panic in the political and media establishment and the barrage of media war propaganda that we've been subjected to in recent days. Now, of course, the war on terror spread from Afghanistan into the catastrophic aggression against Iraq and the interventions in Somalia, Lebanon, Palestine, Pakistan, the orgy of torture, kidnapping and imprisonment without trial that we've seen over the past 8 years. And everywhere that war on terror is now in ruins and seen to be discredited, not as a war on terror, but a war of terror to enforce Western domination and control of resources in the Middle East and beyond. But even as Iraq is now almost universally accepted and seen as having been a disaster and a defeat for the West, Afghanistan is still promoted, as we've been discussing already, by Western politicians and the media as the good war. Now, Des Brown, he was one of the defense secretaries here in Britain, the one before last, I think it was. Des Brown, he called it the noble cause of the 21st century, the Afghan war. President Sarkozy recently called the Afghan war a fight for freedom and democracy. And yesterday, Gordon Brown said that the continuation of this war and this occupation is our patriotic duty. Now, President Obama, who is himself a product of the failure of the War on Terror and the disaster of Iraq, called it the central front in the War on Terror. And while he signalled eventual withdrawal from Iraq, Obama, of course, is escalating the war in Afghanistan with the current surge of 21,000 more troops, a 50% increase on the pre-existing level of forces. But at least you can say for Obama, it is what he promised. He said in his election campaign that that's what he was going to do. Unlike, of course, the British government, which when it began what effectively was a second occupation in 2006 of Helmand province, as Stephen was talking about. It's hard to forget John Reid, another defence secretary in a long line, who promised or hoped at the time that the British troops would leave Helmand province without firing a shot. At least 4 million rounds later, the troops are now being increased from 8 to 10,000, the British troops that is. But even at the level they're aiming for, the NATO forces of 90,000 occupation troops, nobody believes, no military expert believes, that they can possibly succeed in pacifying the country or defeating the resistance and the Taliban.